I was never a man of great ambitions, never one to chase after fortunes or make grand plans that could impress the neighbors. But I always believed I had lived a quiet and respectable life. For nearly 50 years, I shared that life with my wife, Margaret, and in those decades I found all the fulfillment I ever needed. We built a modest home together, not a mansion by any means, but it was filled with the warmth of her presence, the scent of her Sunday roasts, and the sound of her humming while she watered the plants by the window. That house became the anchor of our lives, and even now, months after her funeral, I sometimes wake up and think I hear her slippers brushing against the hardwood floor, before reality reminds me that the sound is nothing more than memory clinging to. The silence. People tell me time heals, but I've learned that time does not heal. It only layers dust over the wound. And when you wipe the dust away, the pain is still raw underneath. Since Margaret passed away, my days have followed the same pattern, almost ritualistic in their predictability. I wake up early, though there is no longer anyone beside me to share the morning light. The first task is to make coffee, and every morning I prepare it exactly as she used to, 4 spoonfuls in the filter, just the right splash of milk, a pinch of nutmeg if I'm in the mood, and every morning I taste the difference. She had some kind of magic with the smallest things, a way of making ordinary gestures into acts of love, and no matter how carefully I measure or stir, the coffee never comes out the same. After breakfast, I sit at the kitchen table, the same one where we once spread bills, grocery lists, and birthday cakes, and I read the newspaper front to back, even the classifieds. It is not that I am particularly interested in local job postings or garage sales. It is more that the paper gives me the illusion of being connected to the community beyond my silent house, as if by knowing the names in the obituaries or the scores of high school football games, I remain tethered to the living world. My name is Harold Jennings, 75 years old, retired from a long career as a postal clerk, and if you ask the people who once worked beside me, they would likely describe me as steady, reliable, and perhaps a little stubborn. Margaret used to call me the rock she could always lean on, though in truth, it was she who carried me more times than I can count. I was not an adventurous man, not the kind to whisk her away to Paris or bring home expensive gifts, but she never asked for those things. She asked only for loyalty, companionship, and the promise that I would protect the home we made together. I kept that promise as best I could, and perhaps it is that very promise that guides me now as I sit in an empty house that suddenly feels too large for a man of my age, surrounded by photographs that seem to accuse me of surviving her. Our daughter, Evelyn, visits from time to time, though not with the kind of warmth one might expect. She comes dressed in tailored blouses and carrying that impatient air of someone whose mind is already half an hour ahead. She works in finance or insurance, something to do with numbers and clients, and she speaks in a clipped tone that reminds me of the television anchors. Her husband, Dennis, is more straightforward, a man who looks at me as though I am a withering tree taking up space in his future garden. They both smile when they come by, but the smiles do not reach their eyes. And when they sit in Margaret's old armchairs, they look around the room, not with nostalgia, but with calculation, as though they are assessing dimensions and picturing what furniture might suit them better. I should not be surprised by this, and yet I am. Evelyn was once a girl who clung to her mother's apron strings, who brought me drawings of stick figures and crooked houses, and insisted that I tape them to the refrigerator. I remember her teenage years, yes, when she became moody and sharp-tongued, when Margaret would sit me down and remind me not to take her words too seriously because every daughter rebels before she comes back home. But I always believed that beneath it she had a tender heart. Perhaps she still does, buried under layers of ambition and the influence of her husband, but the tenderness is something I no longer see. When she looks at me now, it is not with affection, but with impatience, as though she is waiting for me to acknowledge that I am too old to be here, too old to manage this place, too old to hold on to what she has already decided belongs to her. The irony, and perhaps the quiet triumph that sustains me in my lonelier moments, is that this house, the one she covets with such eagerness, was never in my name at all. Margaret, wise and cautious, had years ago arranged that the deed would remain in her name alone, a decision we never spoke much about because it seemed unnecessary at the time. She trusted me, of course, and I her, but I suspect she foresaw something I did not. She once said, half in jest, that people reveal their true colors when an inheritance is at stake, and she wanted to make sure that if anything happened, our home would be safeguarded by the terms she left behind. At the time, I brushed off her comment, teased her for being too suspicious. But in hindsight, I think she understood our daughter better than I did. When Margaret's funeral ended and the mourners drifted away, I was left standing in the living room with Evelyn, who wore black not as a gesture of grief, but as a display of composure. She walked around slowly, her hand gliding over the mantelpiece, as though she were already claiming the dusting rights. I remember her first words to me that evening, spoken with that sharp efficiency she always uses when she discusses numbers. "Dad, you can't possibly manage this house on your own. It's far too big for one person, and besides, think of the property taxes. It would be better to sell it and move somewhere practical, maybe even a senior community where you'd have company." It had been less than 24 hours since I had lowered my wife into the ground, and already my daughter was speaking of practicality and downsizing, as though my grief were just another line item on a financial spreadsheet. I didn't argue with her then. I simply nodded and said I would think about it, though inside me something hardened. That was the moment I realized I would never reveal the truth to her. That the house was not a bargaining chip she could wave in front of realtors or bank officers, but something Margaret had already secured against the very greed that now glimmered in Evelyn's eyes. So my introduction, if you can call it that, is not the cheerful portrait of an old man surrounded by loving family, but rather the quiet picture of a widower keeping his silence, guarding a house that has become both a fortress and a tomb. The neighbors wave when I walk down the street, the mailman greets me kindly, the lady at the grocery store calls me Hun and asks after my health, but inside these walls, the reality is sharper, more solitary. Every creak of the staircase reminds me of Margaret's steps. Every closed door echoes with the laughter we used to share, and every visit from my daughter feels less like a reunion and more like an inspection. I do not know what the future will bring, but I know this. Margaret left me more than just memories. She left me the means to hold my dignity against those who would strip it away. And for now, that silence, my refusal to confirm or deny the details of this house's ownership, is my greatest defense. The funeral itself was a blur, the kind of day where every moment slides into the next, and you feel as though you are walking through water rather than air, moving slowly while the world around you spins on. Margaret lay in the coffin with the serene dignity she carried in life, dressed in the blue suit she had chosen years earlier for such an occasion, because she always planned ahead with a calm practicality I never mastered. The church was filled with neighbors, old friends, and a few cousins who lived far enough away that their presence surprised me, but my eyes kept drifting toward the front pew where my daughter sat with her husband beside her, hands clasped as if they were the grieving ones. She dabbed her eyes occasionally with a tissue, but there was a stiffness in the gesture. The kind of action one performs because it is expected, not because it flows naturally from the heart. Dennis, on the other hand, hardly tried to mask his detachment. He shifted in his seat, checked his watch twice, and whispered something into Evelyn's ear that made her frown, as though, even at her mother's farewell, his thoughts were elsewhere. When the service ended and the pallbearers carried Margaret out to the waiting hearse, I followed, numb and unsteady, though my sense of duty held me upright. I remember Evelyn's arm brushing mine as we walked, but there was no warmth in the touch, only a subtle pressure to keep moving forward. At the graveside, at Dan Moore Stifeo Breithasite the Brace, as the priest recited the final prayers and the casket was lowered, I gripped the edge of the chair placed for me and thought that the earth itself seemed to close over not just Margaret's body, but the last part of myself that has belonged wholly to another. When the final clump of soil thudded onto the coffin, I closed my eyes, and for a moment, I wanted nothing more than to climb in with her, to avoid the empty years ahead. But the murmur of condolences pulled me back, the lines of hands I had to shake, the sympathetic words that felt rehearsed, though I knew they were sincere. And finally the car ride home, where silence sat between Evelyn and me like a stranger. It was that evening, when the mourners had left and the kitchen still smelled faintly of the casseroles and pies neighbors had brought, that Evelyn decided to reveal what was truly on her mind. I was sitting at the dining table staring at Margaret's empty chair when Evelyn walked in, her black dress still immaculate, her hair pinned as though she were about to deliver a business presentation rather than comfort her father. She placed her hand flat on the polished wood, leaned slightly forward, and said in that brisk tone of hers, "Dad, you can't stay here alone. This house is far too much for one person, and it's not safe for you. Think of the stairs, the maintenance, the taxes. You should think seriously about selling and moving somewhere more practical." The words hit me harder than any condolence had, not because they were unexpected, but because of their timing. Margaret had been buried only hours earlier. The flowers from her grave were still fresh in the soil, and already my daughter was speaking of practicality, efficiency, and sale value. She didn't look at me when she spoke. Her eyes roamed the room, pausing on the china cabinet, the framed photographs, the chandelier above the table, as if she were already cataloging the items she might keep and those she might discard. Dennis appeared in the doorway then, holding a glass of wine he had helped himself to from my cabinet without asking, and he nodded as though endorsing his wife's words. "She's right, Harold," he added casually. "This place is a lot for you to handle. Better to think ahead before it becomes a problem." I didn't answer right away. My fingers traced the groove in the table where Margaret had once dropped a heavy serving dish and left a mark we never bothered to repair. That groove felt more real to me than the people standing before me, more honest, and I kept my eyes on it as I replied quietly, "Your mother is not, yet cold in the ground, Evelyn, and already you're speaking of selling her home. Does that not strike you as indecent?" For a moment she looked startled, as though she had not expected resistance, but quickly her expression hardened into the mask she wears so well. "I'm just being realistic," she said. "You've always been sentimental, Dad, but sentiment doesn't pay the bills or keep the pipes from bursting in winter. You need to think about what's best for you and for all of us." She emphasized those last words deliberately, and Dennis gave another approving nod, sipping his wine as though the matter were already settled. That was the true beginning of everything that followed. Though at the time I only felt a deep weariness and a rising suspicion that my daughter had not come to mourn her mother so much as to appraise her inheritance. I excused myself, climbed the stairs to the bedroom that now felt like a mausoleum, and sat on the edge of the bed until the house fell silent. Below me I could hear faint murmurs, Evelyn and Dennis speaking in low tones, but I did not strain to listen. I already knew enough. The next morning confirmed it. Evelyn appeared at breakfast with a cheerful tone that felt forced, carrying a notepad where she had already scribbled figures. She spoke of downsizing options, of retirement communities with full services, of liquidating assets to ease future burdens. I stared at her across the table, the same table where she once did her homework, while Margaret and I hovered, with encouragement, and I wondered when my daughter had transformed from the child who drew flowers in crayon to the woman who spoke of her father's home as though it were a stock to be traded. I gave her no answer, only a non-committal hum, and she grew impatient, her eyes narrowing, as though she could not comprehend why I would not leap at her efficiency. That was the catalyst, the crack, that split the quiet surface of my grief and revealed the storm beneath. In those moments I saw clearly what Margaret must have known all along, why she had kept the deed in her name, why she had made certain arrangements without ever explaining them in detail. My wife had understood our daughter's hunger, perhaps better than I ever allowed myself to admit, and she had placed safeguards against it. As Evelyn folded her notepad and stood to leave, telling me she would return in a few days to discuss things more seriously, I felt a strange sense of resolve settle over me. I would not reveal to her the truth about this house, not now, not ever. Silence would be my shield, and the home that Margaret and I built together would remain untouched by their schemes, as long as I drew breath. The days that followed Margaret's funeral carried a strange duality, as though the house itself was split between mourning and intrusion. On one hand, there were the shadows of memory, the scent of her perfume lingering in the wardrobe, the half-finished knitting project left in a basket by her armchair, the delicate way the curtains seemed to hold the imprint of her touch when the breeze stirred them. On the other hand, there was the sudden, almost aggressive presence of my daughter and her husband, visiting with increasing frequency under the guise of concern, but always allowing their eyes to wander across the rooms as though calculating the market value. They did not speak of grief, not in the language that meant anything, but of practicality, of burdens, of what they insisted was in my best interest, though every phrase carried the unmistakable undertone of self-interest. Evelyn began to call daily, her voice brisk and commanding, asking if I had considered her suggestion, if I had thought about where I might move, if I had looked into senior communities. Each time I answered vaguely, and each time I could hear her sigh of irritation through the line, as if she were speaking to a child who refused to do his homework. When she visited in person, she arrived not with meals or gestures of comfort, but with brochures collected from real estate offices, slipping them onto the coffee table where Margaret once placed her magazines, and gesturing toward glossy photographs of cheerful seniors playing cards in communal rooms. She pointed at them as though they represented some promised happiness, but I saw only the thinly veiled attempt to remove me from my home. Dennis accompanied her on several of these visits, his manner more transparent, for he made little effort to hide his impatience. He complained of the roof that might need repair, of the old furnace that could break down in winter, of the rising property taxes that surely a man on a pension could not sustain. He spoke not to me, but around me, tossing words into the room as though he were already its owner, while I sat in my chair and watched the performance. What struck me most, however, was the subtle way they began to treat me as though I were already diminished. Evelyn would reach for my arm when I stood, not with affection, but with the condescension of someone guiding a frail invalid, though I walked steadily enough. She began to correct me in conversation, reminding me of dates or details I had not forgotten, inventing lapses that did not exist, planting the idea of weakness where none was present. Dennis would shake his head at small things, the way I sorted the mail, the way I folded the newspaper, as if each gesture confirmed my inadequacy. It was a campaign of erosion, steady and quiet, designed to convince me of my own decline so that I might surrender without resistance. One evening, as the sun set and the living room filled with that orange glow Margaret always loved, Evelyn sat across from me with a new firmness in her tone. She told me that she and Dennis had been talking seriously, that they believed it would be best if I considered moving sooner rather than later, that waiting would only make the transition harder. She even went so far as to suggest that I could sell the house now while the market was high, invest the proceeds, and secure a comfortable future. The words were smooth, practiced, as though rehearsed, but I could see in her eyes the gleam of urgency, the hunger that Margaret had once warned me about. I answered her with silence, staring at the fading light on the wall, and after a moment she snapped her notepad shut and stood abruptly, telling me I was being stubborn, that I was making things harder for everyone. Dennis smirked behind her, pleased to see her frustration spill out, and for the first time I felt a simmering anger beneath my calm exterior. In the days that followed, the pressure increased. Evelyn began leaving messages with a sharper edge, reminding me of how lonely I must be, how dangerous it was for an old man to cook alone, how unwise to live without constant supervision. She implied that neighbors had expressed concern, though none had said a word to me. Dennis took to dropping hints about how generous it would be to free up the house for a young family, how noble it would be for me to sacrifice my comfort for the benefit of others, though I knew he had no young family in mind except his own. The house, once a refuge, began to feel like a stage upon which they performed their manipulations, and I grew weary of playing the passive audience. Yet even in my silence I found strength because I knew something they did not. I knew that Margaret, with her foresight, had left the house entirely in her name, and that by law it had passed directly to me, untouchable by their ambitions. They operated under the assumption that I was vulnerable, that I might be persuaded or bullied into signing documents I did not understand. But I understood more than they guessed. One afternoon, Dennis brought a man with him, a so-called family lawyer, who spoke in honeyed tones about simplifying matters, about creating a trust, about delegating responsibilities so that no unfortunate mistakes would happen. He slid papers across the table, and Dennis placed a pen beside them, smiling thinly as though the outcome were inevitable. I looked at the pages without touching them, listened to the rehearsed reassurances, and then I leaned back in my chair and folded my hands. "I will consider it," I said evenly, and in that moment I saw disappointment flash in Dennis's eyes. He had expected a signature, immediate and thoughtless, but I gave him nothing. After they left, I sat alone in the quiet house, the papers still on the table. I could almost hear Margaret's voice, low and steady, reminding me not to let them push me, reminding me that the house was ours, built with years of sacrifice and patience, not a prize to be claimed by those who had not earned it. I gathered the papers, placed them in a drawer, and resolved that they would never see my signature. It was then that I understood fully that the conflict had only begun, that the first moves had been played, and that my silence would be the weapon they could not anticipate. So the escalation had begun, not with shouting matches or overt hostility, but with the slow, grinding attempt to undermine my confidence, to portray me as incapable, to corner me into surrender. Each phone call, each visit, each suggestion dripped with that same intention, and I bore it with the patience of a man who has weathered storms before. But beneath the calm exterior, the anger was growing, and with it a determination I had not felt in years. They thought me weak, but they would learn that silence is not weakness, and that an old man guarding the memory of his wife can be stronger than any of their schemes. It was several weeks after Margaret's funeral when the situation reached a point where pretense could no longer mask intention, the kind of moment that strips away civility and leaves only the raw machinery of desire exposed. Evelyn called one afternoon with unusual cheer, telling me she and Dennis were bringing dinner, that they wanted to spend the evening together as a family, which in itself was suspicious since neither of them had ever been known for spontaneous gestures of warmth. I set the table with Margaret's china, more out of habit than hope, and when they arrived carrying take-out cartons instead of home-cooked dishes, I understood that the dinner was merely a prelude to something else. They talked idly for a while, Dennis commenting on the weather and Evelyn asking perfunctory questions about my health. But there was an undercurrent to their voices, a rehearsed coordination, like two actors waiting for the cue to begin the real scene. It came after the plates were cleared, when Evelyn placed a folder on the table and slid it toward me, with a smile too polished to be genuine. "Dad," she said gently, "Dennis and I have been thinking a lot about your future, and we just want to make sure you're protected. These papers will help with that. It's all very simple, just a matter of giving us the ability to handle things for you if anything happens. You won't have to worry about bills or property issues or mistakes with the bank. It's just a precaution." Dennis, sitting beside her, nodded with that bland assurance that made my stomach tighten. "It's standard," he added. "A power of attorney, a trust. Nothing complicated. Most people your age do it. It avoids confusion later." I opened the folder slowly, letting my eyes drift across the neat rows of legal language, the kind designed to look harmless to the untrained eye, but carrying the weight of surrender hidden in its clauses. The words leapt out at me: transfer, authority, control, and I felt Margaret's absence more keenly than ever, for she would have cut through the deception in an instant. She would have told them sharply to leave such papers out of her house. Instead, it was me, alone with the weight of their expectations pressing down, staring at the pen placed neatly beside the folder as though it were a weapon aimed at my dignity. I looked up and saw Evelyn's face, patient but expectant, her eyes gleaming with a confidence that unsettled me. She truly believed I would sign, that grief and age had weakened me to the point where I would surrender without thought. Dennis leaned back in his chair, arms folded, the posture of a man who already considers victory his. In that instant, I felt something shift inside me. Not the weariness of an old man, but the hard clarity of one who realizes the battlefield has been chosen for him. I closed the folder gently, placed the pen on top, and said in a voice calm but firm, "I will read these in my own time. For now we're done." Evelyn blinked, her smile faltering, and Dennis leaned forward slightly, his confidence cracked by the refusal. "Dad," Evelyn said quickly, "you don't understand. It's just a formality, something that will help all of us later. You really should do it now while it's simple." I shook my head and met her gaze steadily. "Your mother and I lived our lives without these papers, and I will continue as we always did. If you brought dinner to feed me, I thank you. If you brought papers to trick me, then you may take them back." My voice surprised even me, for it carried an authority I had not felt in years, and for a moment the room was silent except for the ticking of the old wall clock. The mask slipped then. Evelyn's cheeks flushed and her lips tightened as she gathered the folder quickly, shoving it into her bag with less care than she had shown in presenting it. Dennis muttered something under his breath, and the polite pretense of family dinner evaporated. They left soon after, muttering about my stubbornness, about how I was making things harder for everyone, and as the door closed behind them, I felt the house expand again, breathing with relief, as though it too had resisted intrusion. That night I sat in Margaret's chair staring at the empty table where the papers had lain, and I understood that the game had changed. They had shown their hand openly now, no longer content with suggestion or manipulation, but moving to outright claim. They would not stop here. There would be other attempts, more insistent, more cunning, and I would need to be ready. Yet even as the weight of loneliness pressed on me, I felt a strange fire inside, the stubborn resolve of a man underestimated by his own blood. They believed I was feeble, malleable, too broken by loss to resist. They did not know that grief, though it had hollowed me, had also sharpened me. Margaret was gone, but the promise we shared, that the home we built would be ours until the end, still bound me like iron. And as I turned off the lights and climbed the stairs to bed, I swore silently that they would not take from me what little remained of her. In the weeks that followed their failed attempt to have me sign those papers, Evelyn and Dennis shifted their tactics, no longer disguising their intentions beneath the thin veil of courtesy, but tightening their pressure in subtle, insidious ways that wore at me like water dripping endlessly on stone. Their visits became more frequent, almost scheduled, as though they had marked my calendar with obligations I had not agreed to. They arrived not with the pretense of dinners or cheerful small talk, but with clipped tones and sharp questions, Evelyn standing with her notepad in hand as though conducting an audit of my life, Dennis prowling through the rooms with the restless energy of a man surveying property he considered nearly his. They spoke often of responsibility, of planning for the future, phrases that might have sounded benign to an outsider, but which to me carried the heavy implication that they had already made decisions about my life and were waiting only for my compliance. It began with the finances. Evelyn, always precise, began asking pointed questions about my accounts, about whether I was keeping up with the bills, about whether I had any outstanding debts. She phrased her inquiries in the language of concern, but I could see the calculation behind her eyes, the way her fingers twitched as though already writing numbers into the ledger of her ambition. She offered to help by setting up automatic payments, by gaining online access to my accounts, so that she could make sure nothing was missed. I declined each offer with quiet firmness, though every refusal deepened the furrow between her brows. Dennis was less subtle. He suggested bluntly that managing money at my age was risky, that scams and mistakes were inevitable, and that it would be safer for me to transfer funds into a joint account with Evelyn, where they could protect me. I listened to him, nodded once, and then changed the subject, refusing to give him the satisfaction of an argument. When the financial angle failed to yield results, they turned to my health, or rather, the appearance of frailty they wished to impose upon me. Evelyn began to comment on my memory, seizing on the smallest slips of recollection and inflating them into evidence of decline. If I paused while telling a story to recall a name, she would tilt her head with that sympathetic look people reserve for the senile. If I misplaced my glasses, Dennis would chuckle and remark that it happens more often these days, doesn't it? They invented incidents that never occurred, reminding me of supposed mishaps with the stove or the car, none of which had ever happened. Weaving a narrative of incompetence that they repeated often enough to hope it might solidify into fact. I saw through the pattern, of course, but it was still corrosive, still capable of eating at the edges of my confidence late at night when the house was quiet and doubt crept in like a draft under the door. The most galling episode came one Sunday afternoon when they arrived unannounced with two strangers in tow, a realtor and an appraiser, both carrying clipboards and polite smiles that concealed their complicity. Evelyn introduced them as just here to give us some options, as though it were a casual matter. And before I could protest, they were walking through the rooms of my house, measuring, jotting notes, speaking of excellent resale value and potential for renovation. I followed them silently, my fists clenched at my sides, each comment striking me like a blow. They spoke of Margaret's kitchen as outdated, of her garden as overgrown, of the wallpaper she had chosen as ripe for modernization. And I felt a rage rise in me, so hot I had to grip the banister to steady myself. When they finally left, promising to send a report, I turned to Evelyn and Dennis and said in a low voice that shook with the effort of restraint, "Do not bring strangers into my home again without my consent." Evelyn's eyes flashed with anger, and Dennis laughed, but I saw a flicker of unease there too, the first sign that they understood I was not as pliable as they had imagined. But the escalation did not end there. Soon after, I began to notice small intrusions into my private space, little violations that at first I doubted and then recognized as deliberate. Papers in my study were shifted, drawers opened, the careful order Margaret had always admired in me disturbed by unseen hands. My checkbook went missing for 2 days before I found it tucked beneath a stack of magazines I had not touched. Once I returned from a walk to find Dennis in the garage, claiming he was just checking the water heater, though his eyes had been scanning the shelves where I kept old boxes of documents. It was a campaign of intimidation, a constant reminder that they felt entitled to pry, to probe, to insert themselves into every corner of my existence. The culmination of their maneuvering came during a family gathering that Evelyn organized under the guise of honoring Margaret's memory. She invited a few cousins and neighbors, arranged a modest spread of food, and then, in front of everyone, raised her glass and announced that Dad has been thinking about downsizing and moving into a safer place where he'll have company. The words stunned me, for she had not only lied, but done so publicly, attempting to trap me in a narrative I had never agreed to. All eyes turned toward me, waiting for confirmation, and for a moment I felt the weight of expectation pressing down, the pressure to nod and smile to avoid embarrassment. But something in me rebelled, some spark of defiance that Margaret herself would have applauded. I set my glass down, rose slowly to my feet, and said clearly, "That is not true. I have no such plans. This house is my home, and I intend to stay here." The silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable. Evelyn's face pale with fury, Dennis's jaw clenched, but I did not waver. The gathering dissolved shortly after, the guests leaving with polite excuses, and I knew that I had crossed a line from which there was no return. It was after that evening that Evelyn and Dennis abandoned any attempt at subtlety. Evelyn accused me outright of being selfish, of refusing to consider her future, of clinging to a house that would only become a burden. Dennis warned me that if I did not act responsibly, others might step in to make decisions for me. A threat so thinly veiled, it might as well have been shouted. They left me shaken, yes, but also strangely invigorated, because in their desperation, they had revealed their true motives fully, and I understood at last the depth of their greed. They were no longer children seeking guidance or even adults offering assistance. They were predators, circling what they believed was easy prey. Yet they were wrong about me. They underestimated the resilience that comes from years of labor, from decades of marriage, from the quiet strength of a man who has endured loss and still stands. I realized then that my silence had to evolve from passive resistance into active defense, that I would need to prepare myself not only for their manipulation, but for the possibility of betrayal more profound than I had yet seen. And as I sat in Margaret's chair that night, listening to the wind rattle the windows, I swore that if they wanted a battle over this house, they would find in me not the broken old man they imagined, but a guardian who would not yield. Not for them, not for anyone. The breaking point came on a gray afternoon when the air outside was heavy with the promise of rain, the kind of day Margaret would have filled with small comforts, fresh bread baking, soft music on the radio, the fire lit even before dusk. Instead, I sat alone at the kitchen table, the steady tick of the wall clock louder than usual, when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel and saw Evelyn and Dennis stepping out of their car with an air of determination that chilled me. They carried no groceries, no gestures of goodwill. Dennis held a briefcase, Evelyn, a thick envelope clutched against her chest, and I knew before the doorbell rang that this was not a visit of concern, but an ambush. I let them in because to deny them entry would have been to admit fear, and I refused to cede that ground. They did not sit immediately, as polite guests might, but remained standing in the living room as though they were officials on business. Evelyn opened the envelope and spread its contents on the coffee table. Documents, forms, contracts, each stamped with legal insignia. "Dad," she began, her voice already taut with impatience, "this has gone on long enough. You can't keep pretending that you can handle everything alone. It isn't safe, it isn't wise, and frankly, it's selfish. We've spoken to an attorney. We've arranged everything. All you need to do is sign," Dennis added, in that smug tone that set my teeth on edge. "This way there won't be mistakes, no confusion later, no court battles when the inevitable comes. You'll be protected. And so will the house. It's the responsible thing to do. I looked at the papers but did not touch them. The lines of print blurred for a moment as I fought the wave of anger rising in me. Not the quick flare of temper, but the deep, slow burn of betrayal. Margaret's chair stood across from me, empty yet heavy with her presence, and I imagined what she would say if she were here. That this was the moment to stand, to protect what was ours, to refuse the vultures circling under the guise of family. I raised my eyes to Evelyn, who was staring at me with a mixture of expectation and contempt, and I realized with a painful clarity that she no longer saw me as her father, but as an obstacle to be removed. I took a deep breath, leaned forward, and in a voice steady but sharper than I intended, said no. I will not sign. Not now, not ever. The silence that followed was electric. Evelyn blinked rapidly, her mouth opening and closing as though she had misheard, while Dennis's face darkened, his composure cracking. "Don't be foolish, Harold," he snapped, abandoning the pretense of civility. "This is for your own good. You don't understand how complicated things are, how dangerous it can be for someone in your condition to manage alone." "My condition?" I asked softly, though my hands trembled with restrained fury. "You mean being old? You mean being widowed?" "Those are not conditions, they are facts of life, and I have managed them with dignity. You come here with your papers and your threats, and you think you are rescuing me. But what you are rescuing is your ambition. You want this house. That is all you want. Do not insult me with talk of protection." Evelyn flushed scarlet, her composure unraveling, and she cried out, "We're trying to help you. Why can't you see that? You are stubborn and blind, and you are ruining everything for us." Her voice broke on the last word, and I knew the truth had slipped free despite her intentions. I stood then, slowly but deliberately, and the movement seemed to unnerve them, as though they had expected me to remain seated, compliant, diminished. "You speak of helping," I said, my voice low but ringing in the quiet room. "Yet not once, since your mother died, have you spoken of her. Not once have you asked how I bear the nights alone. Not once have you offered comfort that did not come with conditions. You come only to ask, to demand, to strip me of what is left. And you think me too weak to resist. But I will resist. This house is not yours, and neither is my dignity. You have mistaken silence for surrender, but silence was only patience. That patience ends today." Dennis moved toward me then, as if to intimidate, but I did not flinch. I met his gaze until he faltered, until he shifted his weight and looked away. Evelyn gathered the papers with shaking hands, shoving them back into the envelope, her breath ragged. "You'll regret this," she whispered, though whether it was a threat or a plea I could not tell. I answered simply, "Perhaps, but I will regret it more if I allow you to turn your mother's house into your prize." They left in a storm of slammed doors and muttered curses, the engine of their car roaring down the street, and I stood in the sudden quiet, my chest heaving, my heart pounding with both fear and triumph. It was not a triumphant victory in the usual sense. I was not young, not strong, and I knew their schemes would not end here. But something had shifted irrevocably. The climax had come not in the form of legal battles or dramatic revelations, but in the refusal of a father to bow to the betrayal of his child. In that moment, I felt Margaret beside me, her hand on my shoulder, her voice whispering approval. The storm outside finally broke, rain lashing against the windows, and I welcomed it, for it seemed to wash away the lingering stench of their greed, leaving the house once more mine, battered, but unbroken. The days after their storming departure were strangely quiet, as if the house itself exhaled in relief once their footsteps no longer echoed across its floors. I moved from room to room with a new awareness, seeing the familiar objects not only as relics of my life with Margaret, but as witnesses to the battle just fought. Each piece of furniture, each photograph, each crack in the plaster standing on my side, holding the memory of a marriage and a home too precious to surrender. For the first time since her passing, I felt that my silence had meaning beyond grief. It had become a shield, a deliberate act of defiance, a way of honoring Margaret's foresight and protecting the last sanctuary we had built together. And though loneliness pressed heavily upon me in the evenings, I felt a core of strength within that had not been there before. As though in standing against Evelyn and Dennis, I had reclaimed something I feared I had lost forever: the right to decide the course of my own life. Evelyn did not return immediately, and when she finally did, her voice on the telephone was cool and businesslike, stripped of even the pretense of affection. She spoke of being busy with work, of not having time for unnecessary drama. But beneath her words, I heard the simmering fury of someone denied what she believed was already hers. Dennis did not call at all. For weeks, the silence between us stretched, broken only by my own steady routines: the morning coffee, the walks around the neighborhood, the tending of Margaret's roses in the back garden. The neighbors greeted me warmly, unaware of the storm that had passed within these walls, and I found solace in their casual kindness, gestures given freely with no expectation of return. It was then that I realized how much I had mistaken family for loyalty, when in truth it is often strangers who carry the purest forms of decency. I knew, however, that I could not rely on silence alone forever. Margaret had left the house in her name, and by law it was mine now. But I did not trust Evelyn and Dennis to abandon their pursuit. They had shown me their ambition too clearly to expect anything less than renewed attempts, perhaps even uglier ones. And so, one morning, I walked into town and entered the office of a lawyer I had known casually for years, a man who had once been a boy delivering newspapers on my route when I still worked at the post office. He greeted me with genuine warmth, listened patiently as I laid out the situation, and by the end of the meeting the necessary documents were drafted: a will that placed the house not in Evelyn's hands, not in Dennis's schemes, but in the care of a local foundation Margaret had admired, one that supported the town library and children's programs. It was a decision that might surprise some, but to me it felt inevitable, a way of ensuring that the home we built together would remain tied to the values we cherished, rather than consumed by the greed of those who had forgotten what family should mean. When Evelyn eventually discovered my decision, the confrontation was bitter and unrestrained. She came to the house with her voice sharp and her eyes blazing, demanding explanations, accusing me of betrayal, of preferring strangers over my own blood. I listened in silence until her fury ebbed, and then I said quietly, "Blood is not enough, Evelyn. Loyalty is earned, love is given, and respect must be shown. You have shown me none of these. You wanted a house, not a father, and now you will have neither." Her face contorted with rage, but beneath it I glimpsed something else: shock, perhaps even fear, that the ground she had counted on was slipping away. Dennis stood behind her, silent for once, his eyes narrow but uncertain, and when they finally left, slamming the door behind them, I knew the distance between us had become permanent. I will not pretend it did not wound me. No father wishes to see his child turn into a stranger. No man delights in the collapse of his family. But there are wounds worse than estrangement, and one of them is to be stripped of dignity while still breathing, to be buried in spirit before the body has given way. I chose instead the harder path, to protect my home, and the memory of the woman who gave me half a century of devotion. In that choice, I found a measure of peace, a calm acceptance that not all stories end in reconciliation, but that they can still end with integrity intact. Now, as I sit in the quiet of the evenings, the lamplight falling gently across Margaret's chair, I feel her presence not as a ghost, but as a steady warmth, a reminder that love endures in ways that greed cannot touch. The house remains mine, not as a possession to be flaunted, but as a testament to a life shared. And I know that when I am gone, it will serve others, carrying forward a legacy of knowledge and kindness, rather than the bitterness of inheritance, disputes. That knowledge allows me to sleep at night even when loneliness presses against me, even when I wonder what Evelyn tells her colleagues or friends about the father she could not bend to her will. For me, the story is simple. I kept silent when silence was needed. I stood firm when firmness was demanded. And I protected the one thing left to me that still bore Margaret's touch. And if that makes me stubborn in their eyes, so be it. Better stubborn and free than compliant and erased.